All right, hello. So I'm sitting down with Suan Sonna to discuss the philosophical arguments against pornography, or at least just elucidating a little bit more clearly and in philosophical detail as to how considerations of the human person, of the nature of the good, and our orientation towards it could possibly affect or aid us into understanding why pornography is essentially wrong. So me and Suan are, of course, we're both Christians from varying theological traditions, but we're trying to look at agreeable metaphysical details with which people of other varying worldviews could come around and agree with just by mere reflection and consideration of our arguments. So we'll, of course, have much to say by way of a continuation of our conversation from last week. So if you notice from part 2 of our conversation, we were kind of discussing an argument as it was the argument for marriage as the proper end of sex, and we're talking a little bit more about teleology and etc. So now in this video, I want to continue with a question to get our conversation going, and that is, why is pornography essentially wrong? Which is what I think the crux of this video is about. So as I was reflecting on this earlier, I thought about other issues with which we might readily consider as essentially wrong. So infanticide, rape, bestiality, and etc. And I want to challenge the sort of presupposition that these other things are wrong because we can draw their objective wrongness from merely seeing them. So that is, I specifically want to challenge the relativistic epistemology of, for example, what Justice Potter Stewart defined as obscenity by, I know it when I see it. So in other words, in this video, we are not saying that pornography is essentially wrong because it is smut. So it may be, but this is not why it is essentially wrong. We are not saying that pornography is essentially wrong because it produces harm, whether at the sociological or neuroscientific level. This may very well be the case, but that's not why it's essentially wrong. Even more so, we're not saying that pornography is essentially wrong because it has obfuscated our view of sex into a pornified mind. Again, this may very well be the case, but this is not why it is essentially wrong. We are saying, and hopefully I think Suan would agree, that pornography is essentially wrong because it pertains to a corruption as a teleological act. That is to say, an act is said to be good because it has achieved various conditions to satisfy what we've called, or what Aristotle has called, total perfection. That is, an act is good because of right intentions, circumstances, and right ends. So pornography, in whatever fashion that it exists, in some way violates one or more of those conditions at all times. So while it may be the case that there's examples of ethical porn where women aren't exactly being subjugated or objectified, coerced, and etc., exploited, they still, even though they meet the conditions of intentions and circumstances, they still essentially fail to meet the conditions of right end. And so I want to continue with Suan, our conversation from last week, his recap, and how he wants to address kind of everything I've just said. So please.
Yeah, well, let me thank you, Stephen, for inviting me again. And yeah, just to branch off of the point about what makes pornography intrinsically wrong, I think, yeah, pornography is always going to fail at having a total perfection. And in fact, I mean, when we consider, for instance, the proper end of sex being marriage, right? And I defended that whole argument last time. Pornography is only ordered towards arousal. And it can only in principle be ordered towards arousal. So think about like when you make the product itself. The product is intended by the producer to titillate the appetite of the consumer. But notice that it cannot in principle fulfill the appetite of the consumer, even though the same arousal that would usually transpire in the context of a real human being present there, even though that same arousal would happen, right, in the circumstance in which you have a real person, you can also have real fulfillment. But in the context of the product itself, arousing those same impulses and desires, it cannot, in principle, the product itself, provide the end to which those desires are oriented towards. So, for instance, it would be sort of like promising someone something, bringing them down a certain path, when in principle you cannot provide that thing in question. So there's something inherently deceptive and perverted and corrupted about pornography itself. And then, of course, we can cake on all the other layers about how pornography has affected society, how it's affected men and women and even children, which we're going to talk about. But I think the bottom line is kind of going back to an article that Scruton wrote. Roger Scruton wrote this article that said it's not the case that pornography is corrupting, even though it does that, but it's that in principle it is corrupt because it is forcing out or kind of resurrecting or not resurrecting, producing these desires in us that are so intense and so real, if we're being honest about them, and that they are truly only fulfilled in the presence of a real person, but the product itself cannot provide us that. So then what happens is, right, when your desire for a real person is being conjured by some, let's say, electronic means, but it's not just a normal desire, right? It's actually a very intense physical desire. And the only way you can actually simulate that real presence is through acts like masturbation. Then you are literally perverting yourself on a teleological lens against the good. So in principle, then, the arousal that pornography is aiming towards is not towards real presence, because one, in principle, it cannot provide that real presence. Second, it's incentivizing certain behaviors that don't entail or require a real presence of a person. So then there's a disconnect between the product itself and the reality that it's supposed to be aiming towards. And that's why it's intrinsically corrupt. It's trying to invite people onto a path that it cannot, in principle, satisfy.
Fantastic. I'm reminded of an analogy that Matt Fradd gave with respect to one can really see that the end of pornography is very much explicitly to those ends of lust and arousal. Because, for example, suppose if I went up to a director and I saw his movie, whatever title it is, and I go to him and I say, the music was absolutely wonderful. The actors and actresses were beautiful. Their performance was absolutely wonderful. But, I just didn't get off to it. I just didn't think it was, I just didn't think it was sexy. Now, the director would either be confused or he'd probably be frustrated because, for whatever reason, the end of which his video, which was, of course, for titillation, for lust and arousal, was not achieved by your ignorance or, whatever it may be for you not being aroused by the video. And so what we're saying is, with this whole language of teleology and the end of sex and this notion of the good that we're wrapping up into this, what we're saying is that pleasure cannot be the end of the sex act, right? So pleasure is something that's accidental. There's not an act to which you could go to it every single time and you'll accrue pleasure, for example. It's very much that we could kind of overdo our desires and wants such that pleasure can actually turn into a kind of pain, and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, the main thing is that, as I said last time, it's really unintelligible to say that pleasure is the end of act. Because, for instance, right, like I get pleasure in, let's say, I mean, if we're going to use a very broad and honest definition of pleasure, I get pleasure when I look at a beautiful work of art. I get pleasure when I'm hugging my friend. I get pleasure when I'm drinking this tea right here. But that doesn't mean that each of them are the same kind of act. Because what individuates them, what unifies them is that each of them have pleasure-inducing properties, let's say, right? But what individuates them, properly speaking, and they have to be individuated because they are certainly not the same kind of act, right? It has to be the object towards the teleological end. And that's kind of the point that we're making here, because to say that pleasure is the end of act actually makes all acts unintelligible. Because then in principle, all acts are just the same. And then that makes absolutely no sense in the first place. And I mean, we can cash this in different ways, but for instance, when I'm sitting here pursuing knowledge with you, right? Like, I mean, I might feel pleasure in gaining knowledge, but that's not necessary. But that's not the end to which I'm ordered towards, right? I'm ordering myself towards truth, towards knowledge. When someone makes an argument, right, and they're saying, "Hey, you're wrong, and here are my premises. You should believe the conclusion of this invalid argument or sound and valid argument," and I ask why, then they'll say pleasure, right? And it's like, wait, no, that doesn't make sense, because it could be the case that I should accept the conclusion of a valid and sound argument, even if it doesn't bring me pleasure, because the object itself is the proper object of pursuit. And the pleasure, as you say, is accidental or even secondary to it. It could provide me kind of the motivation to pursue the object in question, right? But it's not what the object is in principle that the act is ordered towards.
So I have a question. I was wondering if you can kind of help elucidate. What does it mean to say that pornography or sexually immoral acts are intellectually obfuscating? In other words, that these acts are kind of unintellectual, or kind of however you want to
Nice.
frame the language.
Yeah, so I mean, Robert George actually has some papers about this. I think he has one paper called "Is Sex Can Sex Be Rational?" or something like that.
Mm.
And the basic idea is that when we go back to this idea that all human beings pursue the good or what they take to be good, this means that human action is reason driven. And this is to say that the act is ordered towards a certain end. And we can frame this out in different ways, as I did last time. Now, because human beings are motivated behind their action, the proper end that makes them make sense. So, for instance, suppose for the moment that I'm making this argument to you, and I'm saying you should accept that it is sound and valid, right? And then you say, why should I believe that? Why should I accept the conclusion of a sound and valid argument? And then I say, well, it's not because it's the truth. It's because, well, it would make me feel good, right? Well, then there's something wrong there in the argument because in principle, right, what I'm ordering you towards is actually towards knowledge and truth, right? That's what I'm actually doing in the act itself, trying to compel you in that direction. Because if I'm not doing that, then my act just actually doesn't make sense in the first place. Um, so I think John Finnis has an example of this in Natural Law and Natural Rights, where he says, like, if someone raises an argument against you, that process of argumentation is only intelligible in the first place if they believe there was some good to which you were ordered towards or properly ordered towards, right? So then, if human beings are motivated by reason and we can discern the reasons for action, then we already have then a rational basis by which we can determine, is a human act properly ordered? Now, how do you determine whether an act is properly ordered? Well, first, like we can look at a teleological explanation. So because, for instance, as I've argued before, human beings are mind-body unions, and the body also has teleological ends, as even the intellect is ordered towards knowledge, we can begin to say, all right, your conception of knowledge, if you're using your body, right, in a particular act, which we often do, right, of course, if you're using your body and you're using your intellect, right, to direct your body in some way, then what the teleological end of your intellect and the teleological end of your body have to be in harmony. There has to be a perfection between the two, or else then you're producing a dualistic division within yourself, which is improper to the substance that you are. And then moreover, um, um, when we question whether or not an act is rational, right, the other thing too is it has to consider, is it acting upon a proper conception of the human person? Does it actually understand the ends to which it is ordered towards? So in the paper that I published on your website, Sexual Faculties and Sexual Ends, I explicitly explain, right, how each of the sexual acts, first arousal, then like penetration, then insemination, and then impregnation, and then so forth, right? These are all ordered towards something else. So they, from one thing leads to another, right? And there's a causal chain that transpires. And this causal chain occurs under normal conditions in which nature is fully allowed to express herself, or in other words, reach her full fulfillment. And when we look at that ordering of actions, we see that if an act is not ordered towards the total perfection, then it must, in the process of being ordered towards that good by nature, right? So no matter what you say, you're bound to pursue the good. That's just something that is a given, right? So even when you do the sex act, even if you're disordering it, you're still ordered towards the final end, but you're just choosing to obfuscate and avoid it, which means it's kind of like, for instance, if someone knows the conclusion of a true argument and just tries to avoid it constantly, we would say that's a bad reasoner. Likewise, in the case of a human being who tries to avoid the final end that all of their acts are ordered towards, we would say you're being a bad human being, your proper end. So the point there is that the body and the intellect both are rational and ordered towards total perfection.
Beautiful. So it seems as if the unifying principle here, between me and you and others probably watching this video as to how we can kind of reason together on this issue is teleology. How does the modern mind wrap around this kind of thinking? What does it mean to say that in natural bodies they are ordered towards their respected ends. How does one make sense of this kind of language, and why apply it to sex?
Yeah, I think the first problem is that many people have been raised on the fact value distinction. And the reality is, like, if you actually accept Hume's terms, so or how he's often interpreted, it's something like this, right? You can't get a normative fact from a non-normative fact. And in some sense, that's true, right? I'm not disputing that. For instance, like I remember I had a discussion with Michael Jones, and he tried to raise some counterexamples with me, and all these counterexamples weren't actually framed properly to the point where it's like, for instance, I mean, think about this, right? This cup has tea in it, right? And let's just say the fact that this cup has tea in it and that I exist are the only two facts we're looking at, right? And let's say that we're not going to have a rich definition of what it is to be me, to be a rational animal, and we just say that cup exists and that tea exists and I exist. Well, if you're going to be that reductionist, then sure, like there's nothing normative to draw from that. But if you were to say as a rational animal, right, I have these animal appetites, one of which is to fulfill my hunger, to fill my faculty of digestion, to also digest foods that are nutritious, that are in some way going to lead to kind of an aesthetic experience or joy of enjoying the food that I'm consuming, right? Then obviously it makes sense then on how the fact that the tea has certain properties and I as a rational animal am ordered towards consuming those properties and enjoying them, that it would be good for me to drink the tea, right? So to get to the bottom line, a lot of people have just gone kind of gung-ho and totally flattened the teleological plane. And they've just said nature has nothing to tell us about what's good, about what's right and wrong. And then even when they talk about nature, they're not talking about teleology. They're not talking about nature as if it has final ends or ways that it should be, right? So, for instance, Aristotle would say that causes produce certain effects because they should, right? There's a natural kind of flowing of one cause to an effect. And when, for instance, the medievals, they argued that violence is when you prevent something from expressing itself. That's what they viewed violence as. So then, when you look at to nature, right, and you see like an animal that is killed, or you see, let's say, an electric conductor that's supposed to produce electricity, but then you introduce kind of, let's say, something that obfuscates that, then you're not letting something realize its full potential. So in all these ways, then you have forms of the violation of a norm, the violation of what is fulfilling for a thing, what you could say is even good for a thing to some extent. And the point is that a lot of people today, when they talk about nature not being normative, the problem is that first they're not talking about nature in a teleological sense, right? So they're presupposing just a really flattened view of nature. Second, people take the fact value distinction way too far or further than what it actually should be taken to. Like, I think most philosophers, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them are starting to recognize that nature's normative aspects actually do inform morality quite a bit. Like, for instance, how can you have a conception of harm without presupposing proper function? To give just one example. And then also, like, if you want to say that there are rational objective ends for human pursuit, and human beings by nature are kind of in the causal order, then you better not exclude human pursuits from the causal order. You better not make a moral argument or moral theory that is disconnected from the causal order in question, if you're talking about the human act, which is a cause producing some effect. So that's just one place to begin with. And then what was the second part of your question?
I was asking you just about how teleology, how the modern mind can think about it better, and why did this apply to our concept of sex? Like, how does teleology and sex kind of coincide?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so then, when you begin with a concept that a cause produces an effect because it should, and especially under the conditions like, let's say, normal conditions or ideal conditions under which it is fully allowed to express itself, and it's not given any limitations, right? So by limitations, I mean like arbitrary limitations. So, for instance, if you were to allow, if for instance, an electron's nature is to circle the nucleus of the atom, right? And it's a negatively charged particle. And suppose that we just allow the electron to express itself, then in that activity, it would be pursuing its end of revolving around the nucleus and being negatively charged. And even the idea of it being negatively charged means that in certain activities, it's going to produce certain effects. And this is not accidental, but intrinsic. And that's a key part there. So, because because more people are starting to recognize that, like, you can't really talk about morality without having a serious ontology. So, for instance, if you're a moral realist, you're going to have to make certain ontological claims. And part of this ontological claim is going to be about composition. It's going to be about causation, or even the nature of the good, the bad, the right, the wrong. And I think impressive work has been done to show how this basic idea of what's basically called the convertibility principle, fulfillment and goodness are just really one and the same. I think a lot of good work has been done to show how from that foundation you can actually yield an entire theory of ethics, which is essentially what natural law theory is. And I think one good example is David Otterberg's book, The Metaphysics of Good and Evil. So then why does this figure into our account of sex? Well, it figures into our account of sex for, let's say, at least two reasons. The first is because since human beings are in principle ordered towards certain ends, and those ends are discernible, that means that then we can judge human pursuits by what they're aiming towards. So because we know, for instance, that the sexual faculties are ordered towards certain ends, we can judge the human person when they act based on the end that they were aiming for. So this is to say that it is inevitable that you are aiming towards the end in question. Once again, to make this point even stronger, if your sexual faculties were not ordered towards that end, then none of the activities would make sense. So for instance, like, why does the penis produce sperm? Why does the female ovum and ovaries and vaginal canal like act in certain ways when penetrated, right? We can talk about all these really nitty-gritty examples, but the point is that none of these acts make sense unless they are in light of the total end that they are ordered towards. And some people might have the question about, well, how is this normative? How does this compel me? Why should I obey what my body is oriented towards, or whatever? You can put it that way. Well, the reason why is because in principle, if morality is based upon this principle of finality or teleology, or the total perfection or achieving the end, and if morality is also based on this convertibility principle, where goodness is fulfillment and fulfillment is goodness, right? Then it's going to hold all the way down. So for instance, imagine if someone says, well, hey, I'm going to accept, let's say, that harm is immoral, right? So harm should be avoided. So let's say you're a million, or what do you call them? You're following the tradition of John Stuart Mill, and you're like this utilitarian, and you have this harm principle, right? And you say, like, you shouldn't cause harm to any, Mill would say something like, you can't harm third parties, but you can harm consenting parties if they consent to the harm. Let's just leave that out, right? If you believe that it's wrong to cause harm in principle, right, to actually cause someone harm and put them in a worse off state, then you're going to have to accept a teleological understanding of proper function. You have to accept the whole narrative that comes with it, which includes stuff about the sexual faculty. And then likewise, some people would say, well, it's not wrong to cause harm in principle, which could be true. It's wrong to cause harm on the basis of no good reason. All right. So then they're including other concepts here. Well, first, you need the concept of harm. So you need to borrow from teleology. And then in order to understand what counts as a good reason or a bad reason, you're going to need some teleological account of the intellect to know what it is properly ordered towards. Because, for instance, like if you're going to base morality totally off intuitions, and nowadays people use intuition so liberally that they're basically useless. And I mean that in the point of just how argumentation is done, right? Someone says, oh, I have the intuition that abortion is wrong. Another person says, I have the intuition that abortion is okay. Well, that's not really necessarily what intuition is. It's more of a moral belief. But anyway, if someone has this intuition, right, then they could literally say in principle anything is right. If we're just basing it off of what I have reason to be. So the only way to actually limit what counts as a good reason is if you have an account of what the intellect is ordered towards, and you can also offer other facts that begin to shape objectively what counts and what doesn't count.